Two superpowers, one ocean between them, and a world that depends on both. The United States and China together control more than 40% of the global economy. Their militaries consume over $1 trillion every year. Their weapons can reach across continents, beneath oceans, and even into space. But if a war ever began between them, it wouldn't look like anything we've seen before. Not like World War II, not like Iraq, not like Afghanistan. There would be no clear front line, no safe distance, no easy victory. Because the first shots might not be missiles, they might be invisible. A satellite goes dark, a power grid fails, banks freeze, ships stop moving. And before the world even understands what's happening, the system it relies on begins to break. This is not a story about who would win. It's about what would actually happen, step by step, hour by hour, crisis by crisis. Because in a war between the world's two most powerful nations, winning might look exactly like losing. Before imagining how a war would unfold, you have to understand something more important. This wouldn't be a fight between equals, but it also wouldn't be a fight with an obvious winner. Because the United States and China are powerful in completely different ways. For decades, the United States has built a military designed for one purpose: to fight anywhere on Earth. Over $800 billion in annual military spending. Around 11 aircraft carriers, more than the rest of the world combined. Roughly 13,000 military aircraft, hundreds of overseas bases across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. A nuclear arsenal of 5,000 plus warheads. This isn't just a military, it's a global system. American power isn't only about weapons, it's about reach. The ability to deploy force across oceans, supply it for months, and coordinate it in real time. If a conflict starts far from home, the US is already there. China built something very different. Instead of projecting power worldwide, China focused on one goal: control its own region at any cost. The world's largest standing army, about 2 million active personnel, the largest navy by number of ships, thousands of land-based missiles designed to target ships, bases, and airfields, rapidly expanding air force and drone capabilities. A growing nuclear arsenal, currently 400 plus warheads, with fast expansion. But the most important detail isn't the numbers, it's geography. China doesn't need to cross oceans. It fights close to home, with shorter supply lines, land-based defenses, and dense missile coverage. This is where the balance becomes dangerous. The United States relies on mobility, alliances, and global logistics. China relies on proximity, saturation, and denial. In simple terms, the US wants to enter the fight. China wants to make that impossible, and that's why one of the most expensive weapons ever built, an American aircraft carrier worth over $10 billion, could suddenly become a target in a battlefield dominated by much cheaper missiles. Above everything else, there's one reality both sides understand. Both United States and China are nuclear powers. The US holds thousands of warheads. China holds fewer, but is expanding faster than any other country. No one needs to use them. They only need to exist. Because once nuclear weapons enter the equation, every decision becomes a gamble with global consequences. It depends on one question: where does the war happen? Far from Asia? Advantage, United States. Near China's coast? Advantage, China. And most realistic scenarios point to one place: a narrow stretch of water, a global choke point, a flashpoint that has already been called the most dangerous place on Earth. In the next chapter, we go there, to the place where this war is most likely to begin. Every global war has a moment, a place where tension stops being political and becomes irreversible. For a conflict between the United States and China, that place is not theoretical. It already exists. It is narrow, heavily militarized, and more important than most people realize. Taiwan sits just 180 kilometers off China's coast, but its significance goes far beyond geography. The island produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and more than 90% of the most advanced chips, the kind that power smartphones, data centers, artificial intelligence, and modern weapon systems. If Taiwan's production stops, the global economy doesn't just slow down, it begins to seize up. But for China, Taiwan is not only about technology, it is about control, history, and political legitimacy. Beijing considers the island a breakaway province, and allowing it to remain outside its control would mean accepting limits to its power. For the United States, Taiwan represents something different: a democratic partner, a strategic position in Asia, and a critical barrier in the Pacific. Because geographically, Taiwan lies along what strategists call the first island chain, a natural line of islands stretching from Japan through the Philippines that effectively limits China's ability to project naval power into the wider Pacific. If that line breaks, China's navy gains direct access to open ocean, shifting the balance of power in the region. Just south of Taiwan lies another critical zone, the South China Sea, one of the most important waterways on Earth. Every year, between $3 and $5 trillion in global trade passes through these waters, including energy supplies, food shipments, and the electronics that power modern life. This is not just a regional corridor. It is a global lifeline, and it is heavily contested. China claims large portions of the sea, while countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia dispute those claims. The United States regularly operates naval forces in the area to assert freedom of navigation, which means military assets from multiple countries are constantly operating in close proximity. Zoom out further, and the picture becomes even more tense. American bases in Japan, South Korea, and Guam sit within reach of Chinese missile systems positioned along the mainland. Naval patrols cross paths daily. Aircraft operate within minutes of each other in contested airspace. This is not a distant rivalry. It is an active, live environment where forces are already in motion. In such a space, a war would not necessarily begin with a formal declaration. It could start with something smaller: a collision at sea, a confrontation in the air, an attempted blockade, or a sudden move against Taiwan. At first, it would look like a crisis, then a standoff, and only later, something more dangerous. Because once forces are mobilized, the pressure to act increases, and the room for de-escalation shrinks. The real danger is not only the weapons involved, but the speed at which events could unfold. Modern military systems operate in seconds, while political decisions are forced into minutes. In that environment, leaders may not have time to fully understand what is happening before they are forced to respond. This is where the war would begin, not with chaos, but with tension finally reaching its limit. And once that line is crossed, the next phase may already be underway, long before anyone sees it. If a war between the United States and China begins, the first shots may not be visible at all. There would be no immediate explosions, no troops landing on beaches, no clear moment the world could point to and say, "This is where it started." Instead, the opening phase would likely unfold in silence, across networks, satellites, and systems that most people never think about. Within minutes, cyber attacks could begin targeting power grids, financial institutions, logistics systems, and communication networks. Banks might freeze transactions. Airports could lose coordination. Ports might stop processing shipments. At the same time, both sides would be racing to disrupt each other's military nervous system, the complex web of satellites, sensors, and data links that allow modern forces to see, communicate, and act. The United States, in particular, relies heavily on space-based infrastructure for navigation, targeting, and coordination. GPS alone underpins not just military operations, but civilian systems worldwide, from shipping routes to emergency services. Disrupt or disable those satellites, and the effect is immediate: confusion, delays, and blind spots. China has spent years developing capabilities designed specifically for this kind of scenario, including anti-satellite systems and electronic warfare tools aimed at degrading signals rather than destroying entire systems outright. Because in modern conflict, you don't always need to eliminate your opponent's capabilities. You just need to make them unreliable. Even a few minutes of uncertainty can cascade into larger failures. Commanders hesitate. Systems misinterpret data. Responses come too late or in the wrong place. At the same time, information itself becomes a battlefield. Disinformation campaigns, deepfakes, and coordinated online narratives could flood social media, making it difficult to distinguish truth from manipulation. Governments might struggle to communicate clearly with their own populations as rumors spread faster than verified information. The result is not just a military disruption, but a psychological one, a sense that control is slipping, that systems people rely on every day are no longer stable. And all of this could happen before a single missile is launched. The goal in these first hours would be simple: blind the opponent, slow their reaction, and create enough confusion to gain the initiative. Because once one side loses its ability to see clearly, to communicate reliably, or to trust its own data, every decision becomes harder, slower, and riskier. And in a conflict where seconds matter, that hesitation can be decisive. By the time the world begins to understand that something is wrong, the next phase of the war may already be underway. Faster, louder, and far more destructive. After the first hours of confusion, disruption, and silence, the war would enter a phase that is anything but quiet. This is where the conflict between the United States and China becomes visible, and where the scale of modern warfare is fully revealed. Because the next step would not be mass troop movements or long ground campaigns. It would be distance, speed, precision. Missiles would become the primary language of the battlefield. Thousands of them, launched from land, sea, and air, targeting bases, ships, airfields, radar systems, and supply hubs. China has spent decades building a missile force designed for one purpose: to keep adversaries, especially the United States, at a distance. These include ballistic and cruise missiles capable of striking targets across the Western Pacific, as well as systems often described as carrier killers, designed to threaten the very core of U.S. naval power. For the United States, this creates a new kind of vulnerability. An aircraft carrier, one of the most powerful and expensive military assets ever built, costing over $10 billion, is not just a weapon. It's a symbol of dominance. But in a missile-saturated environment, it becomes something else: a high-value target. And the equation is uncomfortable. A relatively inexpensive missile, if it gets through defenses, can damage or disable a platform worth billions. That doesn't mean carriers become obsolete. It means they must operate differently, further from the conflict zone, more cautiously, more dependent on layered defenses and intelligence. At the same time, the United States brings its own strengths into this phase: long-range strike capabilities, stealth aircraft, submarine-launched missiles, and advanced targeting systems allow it to respond across vast distances. American submarines in particular are among the most difficult assets to detect, giving the U.S. a persistent ability to strike even in contested environments. But this is no longer a one-sided advantage. China's growing network of sensors, drones, satellites, and radar systems is designed to track and target movement across its region, turning nearby waters into a highly monitored space. And then, there is the next evolution: hypersonic weapons. These systems travel at speeds greater than 5 times the speed of sound and can maneuver during flight, making them far more difficult to track and intercept than traditional missiles. Both countries are investing heavily in these technologies, not because they guarantee victory, but because they compress time. Decisions that once took minutes may now take seconds. Reaction windows shrink. Margin for error disappears. In this phase of the war, destruction would not come slowly. It would arrive in waves, fast, precise, and overwhelming. Air bases could be rendered unusable within hours. Ports could be blocked or destroyed. Supply lines disrupted before they even fully form. And yet, even this level of force would not decide the outcome. Because missiles can destroy infrastructure, disable systems, and inflict losses. But they cannot control territory on their own. To do that, the conflict would have to move into a different domain, one that is slower, more complex, and far more unpredictable. After the first waves of missile strikes, the war between the United States and China would shift into a phase that decides everything that follows: control of the air and the sea. Because without that control, nothing else works. Not logistics, not reinforcement, not even basic coordination. In modern warfare, whoever dominates the skies and surrounding waters doesn't just gain an advantage. They define the battlefield itself. For the United States, this is familiar ground. Its military has spent decades refining the ability to project air power across the globe, integrating stealth aircraft, airborne surveillance, aerial refueling, and carrier-based aviation into a single coordinated system. American fighter jets are designed not just to engage targets, but to operate as part of a network, sharing data in real time, extending visibility far beyond the horizon. China, however, is not trying to replicate that model. It is trying to counter it. Fighting close to its own coastline, China would rely on dense layers of air defenses, radar coverage, and land-based missile systems to contest the airspace above and around its territory. This creates what military analysts often describe as an anti-access environment, a zone where entering becomes dangerous, operating becomes difficult, and staying becomes costly. In such a space, every aircraft in the sky becomes both a weapon and a target. Engagements would not necessarily resemble traditional dogfights, but rather a series of rapid, long-range encounters where detection, tracking, and timing matter more than maneuvering. A pilot who is seen first may never even see the threat that takes them out. At sea, the situation is just as complex. The U.S. Navy operates some of the most advanced surface fleets in the world, built around carrier strike groups that combine offensive reach with layered defenses. These groups are not just collections of ships. They are moving ecosystems, capable of launching aircraft, intercepting threats, and sustaining operations over long periods. But in waters closer to China, those groups would face constant pressure. Anti-ship missiles, submarines, and surveillance systems would all converge on the same objective: to limit movement, restrict access, and create uncertainty. China's Navy, now the largest in the world by number of vessels, would not need to match the United States ship for ship. It would need to operate effectively within a contested space, supported by land-based systems that extend its reach beyond the coastline. Beneath the surface, another layer of the conflict unfolds. Submarines, often unseen, rarely detected, become some of the most critical assets in this phase. The United States has long maintained an advantage in submarine technology, particularly in stealth and endurance. These vessels can operate undetected for extended periods, gathering intelligence or launching strikes without warning. But even here, the environment is changing. Advances in detection technologies, underwater sensors, and drone systems are gradually reshaping the balance, making the ocean less opaque than it once was. What emerges from all of this is not a clean battle line, but a constantly shifting contest for awareness and control. Aircraft, ships, and submarines all operate within overlapping zones of risk, where every movement is observed, tracked, and potentially targeted. Losses, when they occur, would be significant, not just in numbers, but in impact. Each destroyed aircraft, each damaged ship, represents not only material cost, but a reduction in capability that cannot be quickly replaced. And yet, even this intense struggle for control of air and sea would not determine the outcome on its own. Because war at this scale is not decided by battles alone. It is decided by something slower, less visible, and far more difficult to contain. The system behind the battlefield, the economy that sustains it. Long before a clear military outcome emerges, the war between the United States and China would begin to reshape something even larger than the battlefield, the global economy. Because unlike previous conflicts, this would not be a war happening alongside the world's systems. It would be a war inside them. The United States and China are not isolated rivals. They are the two largest pillars of global trade, manufacturing, finance, and supply chains. Together, they account for tens of trillions of dollars in economic activity, deeply interconnected with almost every country on Earth. When that connection breaks, the shock doesn't stay regional. It spreads instantly. Markets would react first. Stock exchanges around the world could plunge within hours, as uncertainty replaces stability. Investors don't wait for clarity in moments like this. They move on fear, and fear travels fast. At the same time, physical trade would begin to stall. The Pacific Ocean, which normally carries a massive share of global shipping, would become a risk zone. Commercial vessels might be rerouted, delayed, or halted altogether. Insurance costs would spike, ports could slow down or shut operations entirely. What begins as a military conflict quickly becomes a logistical crisis. And then, the deeper problem emerges: supply chains. Modern economies depend on complex, just-in-time networks that stretch across continents. Components are produced in one country, assembled in another, and shipped worldwide. Disrupt even one link, and the entire system begins to strain. In this scenario, one of the most critical links sits at the center of the conflict: Taiwan's semiconductor industry. As mentioned earlier, the island produces a majority of the world's advanced chips. Without them, industries ranging from automotive to telecommunications face immediate shortages. Production lines stop, products are delayed, prices rise. But it doesn't stop there. China is also a manufacturing powerhouse, responsible for a significant share of global production in electronics, machinery, and consumer goods. If its exports are disrupted, shelves around the world begin to empty. Not all at once, but steadily, noticeably. At the same time, the United States plays a central role in global finance, technology, and services. Disruptions to its systems ripple through banking networks, currency markets, and international investment flows. The result is not a localized downturn. It is a synchronized shock. Energy markets could also be affected. Shipping routes through the region are critical for the transport of oil and gas. Any disruption increases uncertainty, which in turn drives volatility. Prices rise, supply becomes less predictable, and as costs increase, the effects cascade through economies already under pressure. For ordinary people, the war would not be experienced through headlines about distant battles, but through everyday changes: prices climbing, products disappearing, jobs becoming uncertain. The systems that once felt stable begin to feel fragile. This is the part of the conflict that doesn't rely on missiles or aircraft. It relies on interdependence, the fact that in a connected world, damage in one place spreads everywhere. And unlike military losses, which can sometimes be measured and replaced, economic damage accumulates in ways that are harder to control and slower to repair. Even if the fighting were to stop, the consequences would not end with it. They would continue, reshaping trade, alliances, and global priorities for years, possibly decades. Because in a war like this, the battlefield is not only defined by geography, It is defined by the systems that keep the world running. And once those systems are disrupted, restoring them becomes a challenge of its own. By this point, the war between the United States and China would already have moved far beyond a regional crisis. Military losses would be mounting. Economic systems would be under strain. Global pressure would be building from every direction. And yet the most dangerous phase would still be ahead. Not because of what has already happened, but because of what might happen next. This is the moment where conflicts stop being controlled and start becoming unpredictable. Not through a single decision, but through accumulation. Miscalculations, misread signals, escalating responses. Both countries possess nuclear weapons. The United States maintains a large and diverse arsenal, deployed across land-based systems, submarines, and strategic bombers. China's arsenal is smaller, but expanding, with increasing emphasis on survivability and second strike capability. These weapons are not designed to be used lightly. In fact, their primary function is to prevent their own use, to create a level of risk so high that no rational actor would choose to cross that line. This is what's known as deterrence. But deterrence is not a guarantee. It is a balance, one that depends on perception, communication, and restraint. And in a fast-moving conflict, all three can begin to erode. Imagine a situation where critical infrastructure has already been damaged, communications are disrupted, and both sides are operating under pressure to act quickly. A missile launch is detected. But what kind of missile? Conventional or nuclear? The systems that must make that determination have seconds to decide. Leaders have minutes to respond. In that environment, uncertainty becomes dangerous, because the cost of reacting too slowly may seem just as high as the cost of reacting too quickly. This is where escalation becomes a chain, not a choice. One action leads to another, not necessarily because it was planned, but because it feels necessary in the moment. Defensive measures are interpreted as offensive. Limited strikes are seen as the beginning of something larger. And with each step, the space for de-escalation narrows. It is important to understand that reaching this edge does not mean crossing it. In fact, history shows that even during moments of extreme tension, nuclear powers have often pulled back. Not out of weakness, but out of recognition, an understanding of what escalation truly means. Because once that threshold is crossed, the consequences are no longer regional or even global in the conventional sense. They become systemic, long-lasting, and irreversible on a scale that is difficult to fully grasp. This is why the presence of nuclear weapons changes the nature of the entire conflict. Every decision is made with an awareness of that possibility, even if it is never spoken aloud. It is the silent factor shaping strategy, limiting actions, and forcing caution in moments where escalation might otherwise seem inevitable. And yet, the closer a conflict moves toward this edge, the harder it becomes to maintain that caution. Not because leaders want escalation, but because the environment itself pushes them toward it. Pressure builds, options narrow, time disappears. This is the paradox at the heart of modern great power conflict. The more powerful the weapons, the more dangerous the path to using them, and the more critical it becomes to avoid that path entirely. But avoiding it is not automatic. It requires control, clarity, and restraint under conditions where all three are in short supply. And that is why this phase is not defined by what happens, but by what almost happens. By now, the question everyone started with begins to feel different. Not who is stronger, but something much harder. Who actually wins a war like this? At first glance, the answer seems simple. The United States has the most powerful military on Earth, unmatched global reach, stronger alliances, and decades of experience operating far from home. In a long, global conflict, those advantages matter. Logistics, coordination, and the ability to sustain operations across multiple regions could eventually tilt the balance in its favor. But that answer only works if the war stays predictable. And this war wouldn't. Because China doesn't need to win everywhere. It only needs to hold its ground where it matters most. Fighting close to its own territory, with shorter supply lines, dense defenses, and constant regional pressure. China could make any advance slow, costly, and uncertain. It could absorb damage in ways that are harder for a globally deployed force to manage. So the advantage shifts. Not completely, but enough to change everything. Every strength creates a vulnerability. The United States depends on global supply chains. Disruption weakens it. China depends on exports and manufacturing. Disruption weakens it. Both economies are deeply interconnected with the rest of the world. Break that system, and both sides feel it. At scale, this becomes the defining factor. Not who can strike harder, but who can endure longer. No other country stays neutral in a conflict like this. Allies get pulled in. Markets react. Supply chains fracture. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, every region would face consequences, whether directly or indirectly. Some countries might benefit in the short term, filling gaps in production or trade, but overall, the system becomes less efficient, less stable, and more divided. Globalization as we know it begins to unravel. This is where the original question breaks down, because victory in a war like this doesn't look like a clear outcome. There is no moment where one side simply wins and the other disappears. Instead, there are outcomes like damaged economies, weakened global influence, long-term instability, reshaped alliances. Both the United States and China might achieve certain objectives. They might hold territory, protect interests, or prevent losses. But the cost of doing so changes them. The closer you look at a conflict like this, the clearer one idea becomes. Winning might look exactly like losing, because even the better outcome comes with damage that takes years or decades to repair. And the world that emerges afterward wouldn't be the same one that existed before. Not more stable, not more predictable, just different. World War II created a new global order. A war between the United States and China wouldn't just reshape it. It might break it.